Her mouth was covered. Her scream vanished into the night as a van door slid open in the falling snow. She fought, but the street didn't stop. That was when a retired Navy SEAL stepped forward, not as a hero, but as a man who knew this moment was no accident. Beside him stood a German shepherd, silent, steady, loyal. Some call it instinct. Others call it destiny. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter pressed down on Chicago, turning the city gray and quiet. Snow drifted through a grocery store parking lot as Jack Miller pushed a cart toward his truck, a German shepherd moving beside him, both unaware that the calm was about to fracture. Jack Miller had learned to appreciate silence, not the kind that followed gunfire or settled over places where men didn't come back, but the ordinary civilian silence of a winter afternoon, the crunch of snow under boots, the distant hum of traffic, the soft rattle of a shopping cart with one bad wheel. It was the sound of survival after everything else had ended. At 45, Jack no longer looked like the man he used to be, though he still felt like him, in ways that mattered. The sharp edges had dulled, the urgency had faded into something heavier, slower. He told himself that was peace. He told himself that every morning. Beside him walked Shadow. The dog kept pace without effort, close enough that Jack could feel the animal's presence without looking down. Shadow had learned Jack's rhythm years ago, the unspoken agreement of distance and trust. Not a pet, not a tool. A companion who understood quiet the same way Jack did. Jack had not planned to stop at the store that day. He rarely did anything without planning, but winter had a way of forcing small concessions. Milk, bread, dog food, normal things. The kind of things men bought when they wanted to believe they were done with extraordinary lives. He reached his truck, popped the tailgate, and began loading bags. His hands moved automatically, efficiently. He was thinking about nothing in particular, about how the snow might be heavier tonight, about whether the furnace had made that noise again last night, about how Shadow's food brand kept changing labels. That was when Shadow stopped. Not hesitated. Stopped. Jack felt it through the leash before he consciously registered it. A tension traveled up his arm, subtle but unmistakable. Shadow's posture changed, not stiff with fear, not wild with excitement, but focused, alert, the kind of stillness Jack remembered from long nights where everything depended on noticing what didn't belong. Jack straightened slowly. "Easy," he murmured, more habit than command. Shadow didn't growl at first. The dog's attention was locked somewhere beyond the rows of parked cars toward the darker edge of the lot, where snow collected unevenly and the lights didn't quite reach. Jack followed the line of that attention, his own senses adjusting, scanning without effort. He saw movement. At first it looked like nothing unusual. People crossed parking lots all the time, bundled in coats, heads down against the cold. But then the movement sharpened into something wrong. A woman stumbled backward between two vehicles. A large man appeared behind her, moving fast, too fast. The man's arm wrapped around her from behind, thick and sudden. His hand clamped over her mouth, hard enough that Jack could see her head snap back in surprise. Her gloves fell into the snow. The sound didn't carry far, but Jack heard it anyway, a muted cry swallowed by muscle and panic. Shadow growled, low, controlled. The kind of sound that wasn't a warning so much as a declaration. Jack's heart kicked once, hard, then settled into a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. His vision narrowed, not in panic, but in clarity. He noticed the way another man opened the side door of a white van, the way a third hovered nearby, watching the lot instead of the woman, the way none of them seemed rushed. This wasn't random. Jack's first instinct was not heroism. It was calculation, distance, 3 targets, no visible firearms, cold ground, civilians nearby, Shadow at his side. And then the other instinct, the one he'd spent years trying to bury, rose up beneath it. Get away. not for himself, for the dog, for the life he'd rebuilt piece by fragile piece, for the promise he'd made to stay out of things that weren't his business anymore. Jack had left the teams because he was tired of choosing who got hurt, tired of living in moments where hesitation meant death and action meant guilt. He'd wanted a world where problems could be walked past, where responsibility ended at the edge of your own life. Shadow pulled forward, just slightly. Jack tightened his grip on the leash. "Shadow," he said quietly. The dog didn't look back, didn't need to. Whatever Shadow was sensing, it wasn't abstract. It was immediate, present. The same kind of wrong Jack felt settling into his chest like an old ache. The woman struggled harder now. Her boots scraped uselessly against the ice. The man holding her was massive, broad shoulders, thick arms, marked dark beneath rolled sleeves. He moved with confidence, not anger, like someone doing a job. Jack looked around. A few people had stopped. Some stared. Some pretended not to see. Phones were raised, but no one moved closer. No one shouted. The space around the van seemed to widen, as if fear itself had pushed everyone back. Jack understood that fear. He lived with its echoes every day. He imagined the rest of the afternoon if he turned away, the drive home, the quiet house, Shadow settling at his feet. The news later that night, maybe. A story about a woman who vanished from a parking lot. A face blurred, a name unknown. He imagined telling himself that it wasn't his responsibility. Shadow growled again, louder this time. Jack exhaled slowly. There was a moment, brief, almost invisible, where Jack Miller stood exactly between the man he had been and the man he pretended to be now, between safety and consequence, between silence and action. He knelt and slipped the leash from Shadow's collar. The dog didn't bolt, didn't need encouragement. Shadow moved forward with purpose, controlled and fierce, every step aligned with Jack's own decision. Jack closed the tailgate. He left the cart where it stood, half-loaded, forgotten. Snow settled into the grooves of its wheels. As Jack walked toward the van, he felt something settle inside him, not peace, not anger, but acceptance. The understanding that some lines once crossed never uncrossed, that pretending to be done didn't mean you were. Shadow moved at his side, a living promise of loyalty and readiness. The wind carried the woman's muffled struggle across the lot. The man holding her glanced up, just beginning to register that something had changed. Jack met his eyes, and in that moment the quiet winter afternoon broke. Snow thickened over the parking lot as dusk edged closer, headlights smearing light across ice and slush while the white van idled in the cold, its open door breathing out exhaust like a warning that something irreversible was already in motion. Jack did not rush, though every instinct screamed at him to close the distance immediately. He walked because walking bought him seconds, and seconds bought him choices, and choices were the last illusion of control he had left. His mind slipped into an old, unwelcome clarity, the kind that stripped the world down to angles and probabilities, and he hated how familiar it felt. The woman's struggle had become smaller now, more desperate than loud. The big man's forearm locked across her chest, while his other hand crushed her mouth shut. And Jack saw the calculation in the man's movements, the absence of panic, the confidence of someone who had done this before and expected it to work again. Shadow moved at Jack's side without pulling now, the dog's earlier tension sharpening into something colder and more focused, a silent readiness that stirred memories Jack had tried to bury, nights when he trusted another living being with his life without needing words. Jack's thoughts fractured, one part of him cataloging exits, distances, and bystanders, another part fighting the heavier question of whether he had the right to intervene at all. He told himself he was no longer responsible for this world's ugliness, that he had paid his share in places far from grocery stores and snow-covered asphalt, that he had earned the right to look away, yet the idea tasted like ash because he knew exactly what looking away led to. He had seen it in villages that vanished overnight, in reports written with careful language to hide the truth that no one came in time. The van's engine revved slightly, a subtle impatience, and one of the other men glanced toward the store entrance, scanning, alert, but not alarmed, which told Jack more than any shouted threat could have. These men were working a routine, not improvising, and routines only broke when something disrupted them. Jack felt the weight of that responsibility settle onto his shoulders. Like old gear he thought he had finally set down. His hand tightened unconsciously, not on a weapon, but on empty air where one used to hang, and the absence reminded him of the rules he lived under now, rules that would not protect the woman if this went the way it usually did. A flicker of memory surfaced uninvited, a younger version of himself kneeling in dust and heat, listening to a teammate whisper that hesitation was just fear, wearing polite clothes. And Jack shoved the thought away because he had promised himself he would never think like that again. Shadow sensed the shift in him anyway, the dog's awareness attuned not to danger alone, but to Jack's internal conflict, and in that silent understanding, Jack felt a surge of guilt that surprised him. Guilt for pulling Shadow back into a world of threat when the dog had known nothing but loyalty in return. The woman's eyes met Jack's for a split second, wide and sharp with terror, but also something else, a flash of recognition that he was not just another face watching, and that look cut through his doubt more cleanly than any argument he could have made with himself. He wondered briefly who she was, what choices had led her to this frozen strip of pavement, but the question dissolved under the more immediate truth that answers could wait and consequences could not. Around them, the crowd remained frozen in its own way, a ring of witnesses bound by fear and distance, and Jack felt a familiar anger stir, not at them individually, but at the collective paralysis he had seen too many times, the way evil thrived on the hope that everyone would assume someone else would act. He had assumed that once, years ago, and the cost of it had followed him into his sleep ever since. The big man shifted his grip, tightening as the woman sagged, and Jack recognized the dangerous moment when resistance faltered and control became complete, when a person was reduced from problem to cargo. Something inside Jack hardened then, not into rage but into resolve, and with it came a grim acceptance that whatever he did next would ripple outward, touching his quiet life, his future, and Shadow's as well. He slowed his breathing, feeling the cold bite his lungs, grounding himself in the present because panic had no place here, and regret could wait until later. He angled his path slightly, positioning himself where the other two men would have to notice him without feeling immediately threatened, a move born of old habits he no longer pretended he did not have. Shadow stayed close, not crowding, not lagging, a steady presence that reminded Jack he was not alone in this choice, even if the weight of it was his to carry. As Jack drew nearer, the sounds sharpened, the scrape of boots on ice, the low curse from one of the men, the woman's muffled breath hitching against the hand over her mouth, and with each step, Jack felt the last thin thread tying him to the illusion of a normal afternoon stretch closer to snapping. He knew there would be no clean ending, no version of events where he intervened and simply walked away unchanged, and he hated himself a little for feeling the old pull toward action, even as he feared what it would awaken in him. The man at the van finally turned fully toward Jack, eyes narrowing in assessment, and Jack met that look without flinching, understanding that this was the moment where paths diverged and could not be rejoined. Snow fell between them, soft and indifferent, and in that quiet, loaded pause, Jack made peace with the fact that whatever he had tried to leave behind had never truly left him. It had only been waiting for a reason to surface again. Shadow sensed the shift, the impending break, and steadied himself, loyalty unshaken, while Jack took one more step forward, knowing that the next one would carry him past the point of return. Night settled fully over the parking lot as snow thickened into a steady veil, muting sound and narrowing the world to the white van, the trapped woman, and the thin stretch of frozen ground where decision finally turned into motion. Jack did not remember choosing to move faster, only the sensation of the world compressing around him, every sound sharpening, every distraction falling away, as if the cold itself had stripped the moment down to its core. The man at the van reacted a fraction too late, his eyes flicking from Jack to Shadow and back again, uncertainty flashing across his face before hardening into aggression, and Jack recognized that moment instantly, the instant when intimidation failed and force took over. Shadow surged forward without a command, not reckless, not wild, but driven by a clear, unwavering intent that Jack felt resonate in his own chest, a shared understanding forged long before this night that danger, once named, must be confronted. The big man's grip on the woman tightened reflexively, his weight shifting as he tried to use her as leverage, and that single choice sealed the outcome in Jack's mind, because it told him exactly how this would end if he hesitated. Time fractured then, stretching into sharp-edged fragments where thought and action overlapped, and Jack felt the old discipline snap fully into place, not with triumph, but with a grim sense of inevitability. He closed the remaining distance in controlled strides, his body moving on patterns carved deep by years he had sworn were behind him, and he hated how natural it felt, even as he relied on it completely. Shadow's presence forced the first disruption, a sudden, forceful challenge that broke the big man's balance just enough. And in that opening, Jack acted, not with rage, but with precision, redirecting force rather than meeting it head-on, because efficiency had always mattered more than spectacle. The woman slipped sideways, half falling, half pushed clear of the van's door, and Jack registered her weight, leaving the man's grasp, even as his focus snapped to the second threat, the one stepping in too late with a curse and raised hands that spoke more of habit than skill. Jack moved through them in seconds, measured not by a clock, but by instinct, aware only dimly of the cold biting through his clothes and the echo of his own breath. And in the back of his mind, a quiet voice noted that this was exactly what he had feared. Not the danger itself, but the ease with which he adapted to it again. One man went down hard, the impact muffled by snow, another stumbled back, shock and pain overtaking coordination, and Jack was already shifting, positioning himself between the woman and the van without consciously deciding to do so, because protection had always been his default state once a line was crossed. Shadow remained close, not attacking indiscriminately, but reacting to movement, to threat, the dog's focus unwavering, loyalty expressed not through noise, but through presence, and Jack felt a surge of gratitude that surprised him even as his pulse thundered. The third man hesitated, eyes darting to the others now sprawled on the ground, recalculating, and in that hesitation, Jack saw the collapse of the routine that had brought them here so confidently, the moment when control slipped and fear flooded in. Jack did not pursue beyond what was necessary, he never had, because escalation without purpose was how people died, and he was acutely aware of how thin the margin was between stopping something and becoming something else entirely. The woman crouched low behind him, her breaths coming in short, sharp gasps that cut through the cold air, and Jack felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper, heavier, because now she was not an abstract victim, but a living presence depending on him not to fail. The sounds of the parking lot rushed back all at once, voices raised, footsteps scrambling, the distant wail of sirens threading through the snowfall, and Jack experienced the strange dislocation that always followed sudden violence, the sense that the world had lurched forward while he stood still. He kept his stance steady, scanning, ensuring there were no more immediate threats, even as part of him recoiled from the fact that he was doing this again, that the careful distance he had built between himself and moments like this had collapsed in under a minute. Shadow pressed briefly against his leg, a grounding touch that cut through the surge of adrenaline, and Jack realized dimly that the dog was checking on him as much as on the woman, a reversal that tightened something in his chest. He heard someone shout that the police were coming, another voice crying, and somewhere close by a phone clattered to the ground, but Jack's attention remained locked on the fallen men until the sirens grew loud enough to demand acknowledgement. Only then did he allow himself to look down at the woman fully, to register her shaking hands, the raw shock in her eyes, and the fact that she was alive, still here, not sealed behind the closing door of a van, disappearing into the night. Relief hit him then, sharp and almost painful, followed immediately by dread, because he knew relief never came alone. It always brought consequences in its wake. As flashing lights painted the snow in harsh color and officers spilled into the lot with practiced urgency, Jack raised his hand slowly, deliberately, aware that the rules were different now, that the world he had stepped back into did not recognize context or intention, only outcomes. Shadow stayed close, unprovoked by the chaos, and Jack felt a fleeting, irrational urge to apologize to the dog for dragging him into this moment, an urge he buried because there was no time for it yet. He gave a brief, clear account to the nearest officer, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt, starting deep in his muscles. And as the scene shifted from immediate danger to controlled aftermath, Jack became acutely aware of the eyes on him, the way strangers looked at him with a mix of awe and fear. He did not like that look. It reminded him of other places, other moments when people had expected him to be something he no longer wanted to be. As the woman was led away toward safety, and the men were restrained on the ground, Jack felt the adrenaline begin to ebb, leaving behind exhaustion and a gnawing awareness that whatever he had just done could not be undone. Snow continued to fall, indifferent and relentless, covering scuffs and footprints alike, and Jack understood with sudden clarity that this night would not end here, that what he had interrupted was larger than a single parking lot, larger than 3 men and 1 van. He rested a hand briefly on Shadow's head, drawing strength from the simple, solid reality of the dog beside him, and as the sirens faded into a steady background presence, Jack felt the first true flicker of unease about what would come next, a sense that this was not a conclusion, but an opening, and that the quiet life he had been guarding so fiercely had just slipped further out of reach. Morning light crept across Chicago through low clouds as snow softened into slush, the parking lot now cordoned off by tape and flashing lights. Yesterday's violence reduced to footprints and questions that refused to stay buried. Jack sat on the edge of the open tailgate of his truck, hands clasped, breath steady by habit rather than calm, listening to the city wake around him with the hollow awareness that quiet after chaos never meant safety, only delay. He had given his statement twice already, clear and spare, the way he had learned long ago when words could become liabilities, and each repetition had left him feeling less like a citizen who had helped, and more like a variable that no one quite knew where to place. Shadow stayed close, a grounding weight in Jack's awareness, not anxious, but attentive, as if sensing that the danger had changed shape rather than disappeared, and Jack wondered bitterly how many times in his life he had mistaken one for the other. An officer approached again, different from the others, not local, posture careful, eyes assessing without the usual edge of suspicion, and Jack recognized that look with a slow, sinking certainty because it belonged to people who ask questions for a living and rarely liked the answers. The officer introduced himself briefly and asked Jack to wait, a request phrased as courtesy, but weighted with expectation, and Jack nodded because refusing would have drawn more attention than compliance ever did. As minutes stretched, Jack's thoughts turned inward despite his efforts to keep them practical, circling the moment he had stepped forward and the way it had felt less like a choice and more like a surrender to something inevitable, and he felt the old resentment flare at himself for believing he could ever be finished with that part of his life. When the woman finally emerged from the back of an unmarked car, Jack barely recognized her as the terrified figure he had shielded hours earlier, not because she looked transformed, but because her presence now carried an authority that hadn't been visible in the chaos, a steadiness layered over shock that spoke of training rather than chance. She met Jack's gaze without hesitation, and in that exchange something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that whatever had happened had not been random for either of them. She introduced herself by name and title, quietly, without ceremony, and the words landed heavier than Jack expected, not because they surprised him, but because they explained too much at once, reframing the night as the intersection of two lives shaped by pursuit and consequence rather than coincidence. Jack felt a familiar tightening in his chest as the implications unfolded, the understanding that he had not simply stopped a crime, but disrupted an operation, that the men he had taken down were not the whole story, but a fragment, and that fragments tended to draw attention from larger, darker structures. The investigator spoke in measured tones, explaining just enough to make the danger real without revealing details that would complicate Jack's position, and he appreciated the restraint even as it confirmed his worst instincts that what he had interrupted would not simply dissolve because it had been exposed once. Shadow shifted subtly, sensing Jack's unease, and Jack rested a hand on the dog, drawing steadiness from the simple fact of loyalty unburdened by questions or jurisdiction. When the investigator thanked him, the words carried genuine weight, and Jack found himself uncomfortable with that too, because gratitude had a way of binding people together in expectations he no longer trusted. He asked only one question, careful and direct, wanting to know whether the danger was finished, and the pause before her answer told him everything he needed to know even before she spoke. She did not lie, did not reassure him with false certainty, and in that honesty Jack recognized a kindred weariness, the shared knowledge that some victories only shifted the field rather than ending the fight. As the scene wound down and vehicles began to disperse, Jack felt the slow, creeping realization that anonymity had slipped from his grasp, that he had been seen not just by cameras and witnesses, but by people who would remember his face, his presence, his willingness to act. He drove home through streets still lined with dirty snowbanks, Shadow silent beside him, and the normality of traffic lights and pedestrians felt strangely unreal, as if he were moving through a set rebuilt overnight to resemble a life he almost recognized. At home, the quiet pressed in again, heavier this time, filled with questions Jack had no immediate answers for, and he paced the small space, unable to shake the sense of being watched, even as reason told him it was too soon for that. He replayed the investigator's words, the careful way she had framed risk and consequence, and for the first time since leaving the service, Jack felt the old corrosive tension between responsibility and survival surface with full force. Shadow settled near the door, not asleep but resting, positioned as if guarding against something Jack could not yet name, and the sight stirred both comfort and guilt, because Jack knew the dog would follow him into whatever came next, without question. Jack stood at the window looking out at the muted city and understood that his life had shifted in a way that could not be undone, that by acting he had entered a larger story with its own momentum, and that the choice he had made in the parking lot was already echoing outward beyond his control. The phone rang, sudden and sharp in the quiet, and Jack felt his pulse jump despite himself, an instinctive response honed by years of bad news delivered without warning. And as he reached for it, he was struck by the certainty that whatever waited on the other end would confirm what he already felt, that the line he had crossed was not merely personal, but visible, and that staying still would no longer be enough to keep what mattered to him safe. A hard winter evening settled over Chicago, snow turning brittle under streetlights as wind pressed against windows like a warning that refused to be ignored. Jack became aware of the danger not through any single event, but through accumulation, the way small disturbances layered into certainty, a car idling too long near his building, a shadow that seemed to pause when he paused, the faint but persistent feeling that the city had begun to look back at him. He tried to dismiss it at first, reminding himself that vigilance could rot into paranoia if left unchecked. Yet the discipline that had once kept him alive insisted this was different, that patterns were forming whether he acknowledged them or not. Shadow felt it too, not as fear but as readiness, the quiet alertness of a partner who sensed the shift from aftermath to pursuit, and Jack hated how quickly that shared awareness pulled him back into an old rhythm he had sworn never to resume. Sleep became fragmented, not from nightmares, but from anticipation, his mind replaying the investigator's measured warnings and filling in the spaces she had left unspoken. And each time he woke, he listened for sounds that did not belong, cataloging them until dawn bled into gray morning. When the call finally came, it did not startle him as much as it confirmed what he had already accepted, that waiting was no longer a neutral act. The voice on the line was controlled and professional, the same woman from the parking lot asking if they could meet again, phrasing it as a discussion rather than a briefing. And Jack agreed because refusal would have been a lie to himself. They met in a place chosen for its ordinariness, a cafe half empty in the cold, where conversations dissolved into background noise and no one lingered long enough to remember faces. She spoke carefully, not because she doubted his intelligence, but because precision mattered now, explaining that the men he had stopped were not freelancers, that their sudden disappearance had triggered responses further up a chain designed to react quickly and without sentiment. Jack listened, hands wrapped around a cooling cup, absorbing the implications with a familiar, unwelcome clarity. And when she admitted that his name and address had likely surfaced within hours, he felt a tightness behind his ribs that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with calculation. He asked about options, about what came next, and her answer was honest in a way that left no comfort, that there were measures but no guarantees, that protection was possible, but avoidance was an illusion. Shadow lay at Jack's feet, still but attentive, and Jack wondered how many times in his life loyalty had been both shield and liability, binding others to choices they did not get to make. As they spoke, Jack realized that the conversation was drifting toward an unspoken proposal, not yet articulated, but hovering between sentences, and he felt an old resistance rise, sharp and instinctive, because he recognized the cost before it was named. When she finally acknowledged it directly, suggesting that his experience placed him in a unique position to assist rather than simply be shielded, Jack felt a surge of conflicting impulses, anger at being pulled back toward violence, relief at the prospect of action over waiting, and guilt at how quickly that relief surfaced. He answered cautiously, drawing lines he was not yet sure he could hold, insisting that his priority was survival rather than engagement, and she did not argue, only noted that those priorities were rarely separable in situations like this. The days that followed blurred into a tense routine, Jack modifying habits without fully committing to disappearance, changing routes, limiting exposure, measuring every interaction for risk, and through it all, the city felt altered, its familiar rhythms overlaid with an edge he could no longer ignore. Shadow adapted seamlessly, adjusting without command, presence a constant reminder that Jack was no longer making calculations for himself alone. One night, as snow fell heavier than it had all season, Jack noticed the car again, parked across the street, engine off this time, windows dark, and he stood in the half-light of his apartment weighing options with a cold precision that felt disturbingly natural. He did not confront it, did not flee, choosing instead to observe, to let the situation reveal itself. And when the car eventually drove away without incident, he felt neither relief nor victory, only the confirmation that surveillance had begun. The next meeting with the investigator was shorter, more urgent. The tone shifted from assessment to preparation, and she spoke of escalation without dramatics, of how networks responded when disrupted, of how deterrence was often mistaken for resolution. Jack found himself asking questions he had not intended to ask, about resources, about timelines, about the shape of what cooperation might look like if he chose it, and he hated himself slightly for the fluency with which those questions formed. She answered without pressure, leaving the decision where it belonged, but as she left, she warned him quietly that waiting carried its own risks, that momentum favored those willing to act first. That night, Jack stood at the window again, watching snow erase footprints almost as quickly as they formed, and he understood that erasure was temporary, that beneath the surface, the ground kept its memory whether it showed or not. Shadow settled near him, close enough that Jack could feel the warmth through layers of doubt, and in that shared silence Jack confronted the truth he had been circling since the parking lot, that he could not unsee what he had seen, could not retreat into neutrality without abandoning a part of himself he did not fully trust but could not deny. The phone buzzed with a message he did not recognize, brief and unsigned, containing no threat yet heavy with implication, and as Jack stared at the screen he felt the final illusion of distance collapse, replaced by the clear, steady understanding that the choice ahead was no longer abstract. He could remain reactive, letting others dictate the terms of his safety, or he could step forward into a role he had hoped was finished, accepting the cost in exchange for control, and as Shadow lifted his head, eyes reflecting the dim light, Jack knew that whatever he chose would define not only what he survived, but who he allowed himself to be next. A cold winter night settled fully over Chicago, snow hardening along the sidewalks as the city dimmed into silence and waiting. Jack understood with a clarity that no longer frightened him that the moment for uncertainty had passed, not because danger had ended, but because meaning had finally asserted itself over fear, and as he moved through the evening, he felt the steady convergence of all the choices he had tried to avoid since the parking lot. The days of being watched had sharpened something old within him, not aggression, but awareness, the ability to exist without illusion, and as he walked the quiet streets with Shadow beside him, he felt neither hunted nor heroic, only responsible in a way that could not be delegated. The meeting earlier that day had confirmed what he already knew, that the network disrupted by his intervention had fractured but not vanished, that retaliation was no longer speculative, and that containment would depend on resolve rather than hope. Jack had agreed to cooperate within limits, not because he trusted institutions more than himself, but because refusing would have surrendered control to forces that did not value restraint. And in setting those boundaries, he felt a reconciliation between the man he had been and the man he had tried to become, neither dominant, neither erased. Shadow sensed the gravity of the night, not as threat, but as purpose, a recognition shaped by years of learning that stillness before action carried its own weight, and Jack found comfort in that shared calm, in the absence of doubt that complicated human loyalty. As evening deepened, the city offered no dramatic confrontation, no final clash to validate sacrifice, only the quiet confirmation that systems were moving, arrests unfolding elsewhere, doors closing that would not reopen. And Jack realized that resolution did not always arrive with spectacle, but often with endurance. He thought of the men he had stopped, not with satisfaction, but with a distant neutrality, aware that they were pieces rather than origins, and that dismantling harm rarely granted the catharsis stories promised. What mattered instead was the narrowing of possibility, the shrinking of corridors through which violence could pass, and in that slow constriction, Jack recognized a victory measured not in triumph, but in prevention. At home, he sat with Shadow in the dim light, the city's muted glow pressing against the windows, and allowed himself to reflect without bitterness on the life he had tried to protect through withdrawal alone, accepting now that avoidance had been a temporary shelter rather than a solution. He did not regret stepping forward, not because it had been painless, but because it had been honest, aligned with the values he could no longer deny without eroding himself entirely. The investigator's final message arrived earlier than expected, brief and procedural, confirming that the immediate threat had been neutralized and that further steps would proceed without his direct involvement. And Jack felt neither relief nor loss, only the quiet recognition that he had fulfilled his role without surrendering to it. He replied once concisely, declining continued engagement beyond what had already been given, and when the acknowledgment returned, he sensed no pressure to remain, no unspoken debt, only closure offered without ceremony. Shadow settled near him, the simple presence grounding Jack in the present rather than the past. And in that stillness, Jack confronted the last lingering fear, not of danger, but of emptiness. The question of what remained when vigilance eased. The answer arrived not as revelation, but as acceptance, that life after conflict did not require forgetting, but integrating, allowing purpose to exist without consuming identity. Outside, snow continued to fall, erasing traces without erasing memory, and Jack understood that anonymity might never fully return, but peace did not require invisibility, only coherence between action and belief. He turned off the light and rested, not expecting sleep to be effortless, but trusting it would come in fragments that added up to rest. And as the night carried on without intrusion, he felt a quiet gratitude for endurance rather than absolution. The story that had pulled him back toward danger did not end with celebration or regret, only with continuity, the knowledge that he had acted when action was required and stepped back when it was no longer his place to advance. And in that balance, Jack found something steadier than safety, a sense of self no longer divided between what he feared becoming and what he refused to abandon. Sometimes the miracle is not thunder or fire from the heavens, but a quiet moment when God places a choice in front of an ordinary person and gives them the strength to choose love over fear. In daily life, miracles often look like courage, compassion, and the willingness to step forward when others turn away. If this story touched your heart, may God bless you and protect you wherever you are, and may He give you peace, wisdom, and hope in your own quiet battles. Please share this story with someone who needs encouragement. Leave a comment with your thoughts or prayers, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue spreading stories of faith, courage, and humanity together. May God watch over you and those you love.